every great fantasy hero stands a sidekick, rolling their eyes and muttering, "Not this again." Whether it's for a novel, a script, a tabletop game, or something entirely different, every narrative needs a stalwart companion to give our stories depth, keep the plot from going flat, and offer insights or perspectives that deviate from the protagonists. Today we're delving into the art of creating those long-suffering companions who keep our main characters walking the straight and narrow. Well, at least keeps them walking. But before we explore how to craft the perfect partner in probably crime, let's talk about what sometimes goes wrong in creating a sidekick. While sidekicks should be whole characters in their own right, they don't always jump off the page that way. As writers, it's easy for us to become so focused on developing our protagonists that we forget that the sidekick too is a real person. They have their own agenda, their own goals in life, their own foibles, fears, fantasies. If your sidekick boils down to a simple tool to facilitate your main character's growth, or worse, is just there to highlight how perfect and honorable and beautiful and sexy your main character is, you may have fallen victim to one of the classic blunders: creating a prop instead of a person. While your sidekick shouldn't just be a tool for the protagonist, they should complement the hero. They should bring something to the table that your protagonist lacks. Maybe it's common sense, or maybe it's lock-picking skills. Maybe it's just the ability to talk their way out of a knife fight and into the swanky nightclub. The point is, they're not just another secondary character. They exist in your story to balance your hero. In my book, Temple of the Inner Flame, the main character, Kezia, is worldly and smart, but she doesn't know much about magic outside of her own. She's also a bit jaded, let down by her circumstances in life. On the other hand, her sidekick and ex-husband is a professor of the arcane, bringing magical expertise to the partnership. He's also the optimist of the two, constantly shining light into Kezia's darker crevices. Without his love and guidance and optimism, Kezia's story would turn out very differently. But even though your sidekick is the counterweight to your main character, sidekicks should still be lovable, fantastic characters all on their own. And by lovable, I don't mean that they have to be likable or plucky. They don't have to be the good guy. They can be the love-to-hate-em sort. They just have to be someone you can get really emotionally invested in. Think of your favorite story sidekicks. Mine is Alphonse Elric from Full Metal Alchemist. Without Al's tender thoughtfulness to round out Ed's single-minded brashness, you get a very different story, and one that I personally wouldn't love half so well. Part of the reason I adore that story with all my heart is because the duo is compelling and beautiful to watch. But it's the duo, the two of them together, that make the story so brilliant. So a well-crafted sidekick isn't just set dressing. They're the magical reagent that makes your story actually work and make it work beautifully. They challenge your protagonist, they expand your world building, and sometimes they even offer enticing hooks for subplots. Those subplots could be romantic, maybe it's a mystery, or maybe it's a thriller. But a good sidekick reminds the audience that there's a world out there beyond the protagonist's immediate quest. A good sidekick can pose questions and alternative viewpoints that engage the audience, asking them to consider how they might respond to a specific situation. That kind of sympathetic immersion is the real benefit of creating a well-developed, well-rounded sidekick. But also, your protagonist needs someone to bounce ideas off of. They need someone to have conversations with so that you're not left to exposition to describe how amazing and in-depth your world is. They need someone to call them out when they're being ridiculous. Someone to say, maybe rushing headlong into the ancient death temple isn't our only or best strategy. You know, the voice of reason, or at least the voice of basic self-preservation. So how do we create great sidekicks that our audience can really get invested in? Well, there's a couple of ways, but let's start with agency. Your sidekick needs their own goals, desires, and potentially even a hidden agenda. They're not just living to serve your protagonist's story. Remember, they're the protagonist in their own life. I know, it's kind of a mind-blowing concept. It turns out characters are more interesting when they have actual character. But this means ultimately that they should have a couple of things. They should have personal goals that sometimes conflict with the heroes. They have their own stakes in the story. What do they have to gain or lose as the events roll out? They have relationships outside of the protagonist, and they maybe even have opinions that don't always align with whatever ridiculous plan the hero has cooked up at 3 a.m. after one too many honey brews. The next thing they really need, though, is their own personal growth arc, and I think this is one that really gets overlooked in a lot of great fantasy narratives. Your sidekick should actually change and develop throughout the course of the story. I know, next I'll be suggesting they should have their own backstory, too. They should. Their story doesn't have to be in your face, and it doesn't need to take up a lot of screen time. But being able to sprinkle in references to their past growing up as a witch's apprentice or growing up in the mines into conversations makes them feel more compelling and real. And it makes your world feel more alive too, because knowing that events that aren't related to the primary story continue to unfold off camera, that makes the audience more immersed in the world. It makes the world feel bigger. It makes the world feel lived in. But back to the character arc. Your sidekick should not be the same person at the beginning of the story or series as they are at the end. This means that they're going to face their own challenges, they have their own wounds that they need to heal, and they need to learn and evolve as time goes on. So now that we've established that sidekicks should be actual people and not just emotional support furniture, let's talk about some common sidekick types and tropes. Now, these aren't boxes that you should be stuffing your characters into, far from it. A one-sided character is never going to be interesting enough to support a strong protagonist. But I do think that archetypes can be interesting and useful, so let's take a look at just a couple as a jumping off point. You've got your classic types. You've got the brain or the technical expert. I like Kaylee from Firefly for this role. The muscle, think Amos Burton from The Expanse. The love interest, I always reference Chloe Decker from Lucifer. Now, I know some of y'all are thinking that Chloe Decker is not a sidekick, and you might be right. But the show is called Lucifer, after all. It's not called Chloe. So there's the mentor. Uncle Iroh from Avatar is my very favorite all-time go-to example for this. And of course, everyone's favorite, the comic relief. I'm an uncouth Gen X troglodyte, so my go-to here is always Jay and Silent Bob. But if you force me to choose someone from the fantasy genre, I have to go with Princess Donut from Dungeon Crawler Carl. This list of archetypes is by no means exhaustive, and in later videos, we'll take a closer look at these archetypes and others as well. But here's where it gets really interesting. The best sidekicks don't fit neatly into any one of these categories, because just like real people and your main character probably, they're multifaceted. So take Dr. Spock, for example, from Star Trek. Yes, he's the brain, but he's also the skeptic who's constantly questioning human logic, or the frequent lack thereof. And sometimes, completely by accident, he becomes the comic relief, though he'd probably raise an eyebrow at that observation, which I would do here if I could, but I cannot. So now that we know what goes into making a great sidekick, let's make one now. I've created a complete sidekick character ready for you to use in your novels, scripts, comics, TTRPGs, or anything else you want. Completely free and completely without any copyright restrictions. So you're free to download the character sheet and use it as you want. You can find the link in my description. So we'll look at two versions of the same character. One version we will pair with a more serious hero, and one we will design to pair with a more whimsical protagonist. That way we can keep the balance. So here we go. Geraldine Gidget Navarro grew up in a family of magical archivists where her parents maintained an extensive collection of spellbooks, magical histories, and supernatural records. Unlike most magical families who dealt in artifacts or spells, the Navarros traded in pure information. From a young age, Gidget learned that knowledge was the most valuable currency in the magical world. Chatty and charismatic, 16-year-old Gidget discovered a talent for gathering and connecting information. She began working as a teenage informant, collecting gossip and secrets from unsuspecting people who found her charming and disarming. But everything changed during a seemingly routine information exchange. A powerful magical family hired her to gather intelligence on a particularly tricky spell. Unbeknownst to Gidget, they were using her intel to plan a raid on her family's archives. The raid destroyed generations of irreplaceable magical knowledge, and worse, her parents blamed her for inadvertently helping their attackers. The family business was ruined, and the magical community's trust in the Navarro name was shattered. The destruction of her family's archives and reputation occurred because she failed to recognize how gathered information would be used. She wasn't just an unwitting participant in the loss of her family's legacy. Her actions directly enabled it. The betrayal taught her that even seemingly harmless information can become a weapon in the wrong hands. This is her emotional wound. And as a result of that wound, she develops a misbelief about the world. And that misbelief is, information is power, but sharing it makes you vulnerable. I must know everything while revealing nothing, or I'll lose everything again. She develops a coping mechanism. Gidget maintains a complex web of half-truths and misdirection, never giving anyone the full picture. She treats every interaction like a transaction, carefully measuring what information she gives versus what she receives. She uses humor and charm to deflect when people get too close to learning her real thoughts or feelings. Gidget goes through life believing that in order to be truly happy and successful, she needs to rebuild her family's reputation by becoming the most trusted, and therefore most powerful, information broker in the magical community, without ever letting anyone ever know enough about her to hurt her again. That's what she thinks she wants. But in reality, what Gidget actually needs is to find a way to trust and be trusted again, to share knowledge freely without fear, and to use her skills to protect rather than just survive. This version of Gidget emerges as the playful foil. She's the brain with the side of comic relief, using her charm and wit to deflect while she's processing her trust issues. You can think of her as a walking Wikipedia page that tells dad jokes to avoid emotional vulnerability and to keep things lighthearted when the hero gets too broody. But watch what happens when we pair her with a more whimsical protagonist. She has the same backstory, the same emotional wounds, but a completely different expression. In this version of Gidget, instead of cracking jokes and deflecting, she becomes meticulously organized, clinging desperately to structure and doing things the right way. She believes that without perfect systems and complete control of information flow, disaster is inevitable. Spontaneity and trust are luxuries she can't afford. In this version of Gidget, maybe she's the brain meets the moral compass, or even the skeptic, desperately trying to impose order on chaos, while secretly admiring the protagonist's ability to color outside the lines. So notice how in both versions, her core wound remains exactly the same, her information broker identity stays intact, and her ultimate desire, which is to trust and be trusted, doesn't change. But her coping mechanisms and her expressions of that shift to complement the protagonist. One reason Gidget works so well as a successful sidekick is because she has agency. She isn't just tagging along for the protagonist's wild ride, she has her own mission, rebuilding her fantasy's reputation and becoming the most trusted information broker in the magical community. And because she has emotional wounds, she also has room for a personal character growth arc. And depending on where your story goes, Gidget's story can unfold in myriad different ways. Whether she's learning to trust again, or learning that sometimes the best systems need flexibility, Gidget's journey isn't just a subplot. Her struggle between protecting information and sharing it mirrors larger themes of trust, connection, and the price of knowledge. And if one of your hero's goals is uncovering an ancient secret about a power-hungry cabal, well, that can make for a really interesting juxtaposition. And that's the entire point of the sidekick, to provide that balance and contrast. So now that we've seen how it works in action, let's talk about implementing these principles in your own writing. Number 1, start with the wound. Not the role they're going to play, not their witty comeback, their core wound. Gidget's betrayal and its consequences shape everything about her character, and your sidekick needs that same emotional foundation. Number 2, give them conflicts that don't revolve around the protagonist. They should have lives when they're off camera. Their personal goals should sometimes create tension with the main plot. Number 3, let them be right sometimes, and not just about small things like, maybe don't eat the stew given to you by the old lady who was obviously a hag in disguise. No, give them things to be right about that matter. Let them be right about big things. Let their perspectives challenge your protagonist's worldview. Let them win arguments with actual logic that change the progression of your whole story. That's where the magic lies. And number 4, give them their own support system. If your sidekick's entire social circle consists of your protagonist and a dying houseplant, you haven't written a partnership, you've written a hostage situation. So remember, your sidekick isn't just there to make your protagonist look good. They're there to make your story great. They're the person pointing out the plot holes before your readers do. They're the voice of reason when your hero decides midnight spelunking in the dragon's cave is a solid life choice. They're the ones keeping your protagonist alive long enough to actually be the protagonist. And sometimes they're the real hero of the story. They're just better at delegating the glory. So don't forget to grab Gidget's character profile in the description below, and let me know in the comments about your favorite well-crafted sidekicks, even if they're your own. I'd love to hear about them. So I'll see you again on the other side.